Good afternoon, students. Today is Wednesday, 17 February 2021. This is our only lecture for this week. Now, keep in mind that the exam was originally scheduled for tomorrow, which is Thursday the 18th. But as I explained to you, both in an email to all of you and in a posting on Canvas, I have moved the exam to Monday. Things should be back to normal by Monday, as far as internet connections being back on and electricity and things like that. So we're planning on Monday from 8 in the morning until 8 in the evening. At some point during that 12-hour period, you must go to Canvas, click on the word quizzes once you get into your course, and you'll see an exam there called First Examination of 3. And once you get started, you have only 75 minutes to complete the exam. So make sure you get through it. Don't spend too much time on any one question. And when you're done, make sure you go back if it allows you to and answer all of the questions. So in general, make sure that you answer all the questions. There are 40 questions altogether. Okay, so that's Monday. So after today, the next time you see me will be Tuesday or perhaps Wednesday for the first lecture of next week. So there will be 2 lectures next week following the exam on Monday. And I have already posted the reading for your course in Canvas. It's a Supreme Court case out of New Mexico, a New Mexico Supreme Court case on what's called the right to die. And I've posted the case for you to read. It's only 28 pages long. Read, let's say, at least half of it for the first lecture, and then the other half for the second lecture next week. We will also be discussing it on a third day, the week after next. We'll finish it up. So just make sure you stay ahead of me in your reading of that case. Okay, so there will be other items posted that have to do with this New Mexico Supreme Court case. So keep checking on Canvas on a daily basis. Whenever you see a new handout, print it, put it in your notebook, and have it handy when you're watching my video, because sometimes I refer to the postings while I'm lecturing. Okay, today we're going to wrap up the essay by the Emanuels, Ezekiel and Linda Emanuel. We've spent 2 days on it. Today we're going to discuss approximately the final third of that essay. You recall that the purpose of this article is to lay out 4 models or ideals of the physician-patient relationship. And eventually the Emanuels are going to argue in favor of one of the 4 models. And by now you know which one that is. It's what they call the deliberative model. So let's do a quick review of the 4 models very quickly. The first model that they discuss is called the paternalistic model. In that model, the doctor plays the role of a parent. So perhaps we should call it the parentalistic model instead of paternal, which means fatherly. So in that model, the doctor makes a decision for the patient based upon what the doctor deems to be the best interest of that patient. So it's as though a parent is making decisions for an underage child. The second model is called the informative model. In some ways, it's at the other extreme. The doctor's role here is very limited. The doctor has expertise in medicine. The patient goes in to see the doctor, explains to the doctor what the problem is, what the symptoms are. The doctor will conduct an examination, make a diagnosis of what's going on, and then explain to the patient what the diagnosis is, what the prognosis is, which is the expected course of the disease or illness. The doctor will then explain what the various treatment options are, together with the costs and benefits of each of those options. When all of that is said and done, and after the patient has a period in which to ask questions, the patient will decide which course of action to pursue. And the doctor presumably will follow the patient's instructions. So it treats the doctor as though the doctor were a mechanic and you've taken your car in for diagnosis of some problem that you're having. The third model is the interpretive model. In this model, the doctor's role is a little bit larger than it is in the informative model. The doctor's role is to discuss with the patient the disease or illness or injury, whatever it may be. The doctor's job is to elicit the values that the patient has and help the patient sort through those values so that the patient can make an informed decision about which course of treatment to pursue. So the doctor does not supply the values, the patient supplies the values. The doctor tries to extract or bring into the open what the patient's values are so that the patient can then determine which course of treatment to undergo. So the doctor has a larger role to play. The doctor is to help the patient understand his or her own values and how they bear upon the treatment. The fourth model, the one that the Emanuels end up arguing for, is called the deliberative model. Here, the doctor persuades or tries to persuade the patient to undergo a particular course of treatment. And the doctor will bring into play lots of things, not only the patient's values, but values that the patient doesn't have, values that we might call moral or social in nature. So the doctor will determine which course of treatment promotes values in general, and will try to persuade the patient to act upon that. And you saw an example of that in the clinical case that we discussed in our most recent lecture, the woman who has breast cancer. The doctor in that case tried to persuade her to sign up for a clinical trial. And he argued that she would get adequate treatment for her breast cancer, but that she would also be contributing to medicine and therefore to helping other women in the future. So that might come at some cost to her, right? While she's getting adequate treatment for her breast cancer by signing up for the clinical trial, maybe she would get fuller and better treatment if she stayed out of that trial and focused only on her own well-being. So the doctor sometimes will try to persuade the patient to undergo a course of treatment that is not the very best for the patient, but that is designed to promote values that the patient doesn't have, social or moral values, I've been calling them. Okay, now before we get into the objections to the various models, which is the next thing we have to do, the Emanuels have a short section entitled Shared Decision Making, and they point out that this is a fairly new thing in the past few decades. Many philosophers and others have advocated that the patient and the doctor share decision making, that they both contribute to it. And what they have said is that the patient supplies the values and the doctor supplies the expertise and the facts. And the problem with that, according to the Emanuels, is that it re-implements the informative model, which views the doctor as a mechanic. They say on page 2224, despite its dominance, many have found the informative model arid. And if you look up the word arid in a dictionary, you'll see that it means dry, parched, or barren. It doesn't leave much room for the doctor. It doesn't give the doctor much of a role in the patient's treatment. And so they point out that this shared decision-making model, which divides up the decision-making, some for the patient, some for the doctor, that tends to revert to this arid informative model. And of course, the Emanuels don't like that model. They prefer the deliberative model, which gives the doctor a greater role in decision-making. So as they put it on that same page, 2224, this shared decision-making ends up, quote, re-embodying the informative model under a different label. So what they're saying is the informative model is dry and unacceptable. They call it arid. And this thing called shared decision-making simply is a new label for that same old informative model, which they think is problematic. So they're not very high on what's called shared decision-making. And that's really all they all they say in this short section of their essay. So let's turn to some objections. The Emanuels list in a very kind of cursory way, which means they're just canvassing various objections that have been raised to each of these models. Let's just go through and look at some of the main objections to each model. They even raise objections to their own preferred model, which we'll get to in a moment. What are the objections that you can think of to the paternalistic model, the one that treats the doctor as a parent or a father or mother? They say that the Emanuels say that this model does have a place. It is appropriate in emergency situations. They say it's justified in emergencies. Why? Because often in emergencies, the patient may be incompetent to make a decision. So the doctor who may be on hand will have to decide for the patient what should be done. And in a case like that, the doctor may fall back on what the doctor thinks most patients would want in a situation like that. So in emergency situations, there's really nothing else to do other than have the doctor make the treatment decision. Right? The informative model, the interpretive model, and the deliberative model, all of them require that the patient discuss things with the doctor. And of course, you can't do that in an emergency where the patient may be unconscious or in such pain that the patient can't think clearly. Okay, so that's the first point they make. One objection to the paternalistic model is that it doesn't take the patient's values fully into account. And the Emanuels point out that it does have its place in emergency situations. They point out on page 2224 that even physicians rarely advocate the paternalistic model as an ideal for routine physician-patient interactions. So it's kind of outmoded or obsolete almost. Most doctors no longer view that as the ideal patient-doctor relationship. Right? Most physicians have moved on either to the informative model, to the interpretive model, or to the deliberative model. Now, I just have one question. I'm going to raise some questions along the way. You can take these as criticisms if you want, but I just take them as relevant questions that need to be answered. What if a patient prefers the paternalistic model? Now, maybe most patients do not want to be treated like a child by their doctor. That's fine. What if the overwhelming majority of patients don't want to be treated like a child? Some patients may very well want that. I can imagine a patient who says, I'm scared. I may have been diagnosed with cancer or some other scary disease, and I prefer that my doctor make decisions for me based upon what the doctor thinks is best for me. So some patients may be perfectly willing to delegate decision-making to their doctor. What do the Emanuels say in a case like that? Is the doctor supposed to say to the patient, oh no, I reject the paternalistic model, and even though you're requesting that I make a decision for you, I won't do so. I refuse to do so. You're going to have to participate in the decision making in the course of your treatment. Now that seems awfully rude and unprofessional. Shouldn't the doctor defer to the wishes of his or her patient? And all I'm suggesting is that for those patients who may be rare, who want their doctor to make decisions for them, that should be open, that should be available as an option. So I've raised the objection to this model that the Emanuels raise, and I've added a reply to it. Right? They say this model is unacceptable, and they also add that most doctors themselves reject it. And I'm simply asking a question. What if a particular patient wants the doctor to make the decision? Wouldn't that make it appropriate for the doctor to embody this model for at least that patient? Okay, let's look at some objections to the informative model. the first thing the Emanuel say is this, from page 2224. They say the informative model lacks a caring approach that requires understanding what the patient values or should value and how his or her illness impinges on these values, unquote. So the Emanuels say that the informative model isn't caring enough. It tells the doctor to just listen to the patient, diagnose the patient, lay out the options for the patient, and let the patient decide. To the Emanuels, that takes the doctor too far out of the picture. The doctor needs to be more involved and exhibit more care for the patient's well-being. Now, I have a question to raise about that. Do we want our mechanics to care about our car? I suspect we do not. We go take our car to a trained professional mechanic because A, that mechanic has knowledge that we lack, and B, the mechanic has the tools, equipment, and expertise to diagnose the problem and to repair it once we tell the mechanic what we want or which course of action to take. We don't care that our mechanic doesn't care about us or our vehicle. In fact, we don't want the mechanic to care. We just want the mechanic to fix the car so that we can drive it. Okay? Caring is not part of the equation at all. So why can you imagine a patient who says, I don't want my doctor to care. I went to the doctor for the doctor's expertise, not because the doctor is sympathetic or empathetic or caring or compassionate or any of those things. So the Emanuels think it's a problem with this model that it removes caring from the picture. I'm suggesting that for some patients, maybe not for all, but for at least some patients, that's okay, right? Maybe some patients don't want their doctors to be emotionally involved to the point of caring and being compassionate. Another problem the Emanuels have noted with regard to this model, the informative model, is this, and I'll quote them. It, quote, perpetuates and accentuates the trend towards specialization and impersonalization within the medical profession, unquote. So let's unpack that. The Emanuels are saying that there have been some disturbing trends in medicine, at least disturbing to them. One of them is specialization. Doctors have gotten so specialized that they've lost sight of the big picture. They've lost sight of the whole patient, so to speak. They look at the patient as a machine with a problem, and their goal is to fix the machine so that it gets running again. Another problem or trend that the Emanuels find disturbing is impersonalization. They think that, and this goes along with specialization, medicine has become impersonal, and it's becoming more so with each passing year. Doctors care less and less about the whole person and more about fixing or correcting whatever the ailment is that the patient has. So they claim, the Emanuels claim, that this model, the informative model, speeds up these two disturbing trends, right? It makes them worse. It perpetuates and accentuates two bad tendencies or trends that are taking place. Okay? It increases specialization. It increases impersonal treatment. And so they think if we adopt this model, these trends are going to only pick up speed and take us who knows where, probably not to a good place. And finally, this model, they say, on page 2224, same page, this model presupposes something false. What is it? It presupposes, quote, that persons possess known and fixed values, unquote. And you can see why it does. Remember, in the informative model, the doctor's role is as follows. It's to diagnose the patient's condition, to find out what's going on, Secondly, to tell the patient what the prognosis is. So the doctor will say, if we do nothing, this will be the course of your disease or injury. If we do option A, if we follow option A, this will be the course of what will happen to your condition. If we choose option B, there will be another course, option C, and so forth. The doctor will then describe the costs and benefits to the patient of each of those courses of treatment, as well as doing nothing, which we can think of as a course of treatment. And the patient then, having heard all of that, will apply his or her values and make a decision about what to do. According to the Emanuels, this picture presupposes that patients have fixed and known values. And that's false, they say. Most patients haven't thought through their own values. They need someone to help them clarify or elicit, which means bring out into the open. And the doctor is perfectly positioned to play that role for the patient. So the Emanuels view this as a problem with this model. They call it an objection. It presupposes something false about many or most patients. Most patients do not have known values or fixed values. Their values are in a state of development or a state of flux. And they need someone to discuss their values with them, to bring them out into the open so that they're known and clear. They say that people are often uncertain about what they actually want. Now, you may be perfectly clear what you want your car to do, right? Your goal may be to have a car that's reliable. You need it to get back and forth to work. And you need to know that when you get in your car, it will start, it will run properly and stay running until you get to work, and that when you get back in it at the end of the day, you'll make it home. And you want to do that for as long as possible. Okay? If that's what you want for your car, we can say your values are known and fixed. But sometimes patients don't have clear-cut goals or objectives or ends or values, and they need some help sorting through their own values. So when they say people are often uncertain about what they actually want, that's probably true for some percentage of people. Probably not all, though. And my question here is, what about people who are certain? If there is someone who has done his or her research on the internet or wherever and has gathered information about his or her illness or ailment or injury, whatever it may be, some people have values that are known to them and that are fixed. Shouldn't they be able to get a physician who will follow the informative model and listen carefully to what the patient says and then follow that patient's directions? There are, by the way, as I'm sure you know, there are some reliable websites on the internet for patients who want to do research about various illnesses. You can go to WebMD. I found that a reliable source of information. The Mayo Clinic runs a website where you can look up any condition from rheumatoid arthritis to cystic fibrosis, the flu, the common cold, any disease or ailment that you can think of. You'll find something on the Mayo Clinic's website, and it will have a list of symptoms. It will have a list of causes that are known. It will have a variety of different treatments together with their costs and benefits. Someone who's internet savvy can actually learn a lot about his or her condition and what the options are before you even go see an actual flesh and blood doctor. Now, maybe not everyone is capable of doing this, but some people are. And those people may be the ones who prefer the informative model. Also, the National Institutes of Health has a useful website that many people can visit and learn from. Okay, next model. Let's say a few words about the interpretive model and why the Emanuels reject it. What do they take to be the objections to it? They say on that same page, quote, technical specialization militates against physicians cultivating the skills necessary to the interpretive model, unquote. Now remember what the model says. The physician's job is to be a midwife. The physician, in the course of discussing with the patient what the illness is, what the courses of treatment are, and so on, the physician will try to elicit the patient's values, worries, concerns. What do you want out of life? What's most important to you? Do you want just the ability to move around without pain? Do you want to be able to play with your grandchildren? Are there certain hobbies such as gardening or tennis that you would like to continue participating in? Those sorts of things. The physician can discuss with the patient and help the patient understand the patient's own values. Which values are most important? Which values are of less importance? How many physicians are trained in doing that sort of thing? The Emanuels ask, right? This requires a certain amount of skill that a doctor is unlikely to have obtained in medical school or in medical training. Right? This is a discursive skill. This requires the skills of a counselor. In fact, this is one of the labels the Emanuels put on this. Think of the doctor as a midwife or a counselor. How many doctors are trained in counseling to the point where they can, through a series of questions, bring out the patient's values? So this model requires skills that many or most physicians simply do not have. It may be that a particular physician just happens to be good at eliciting patients' values and helping sort through them, but probably most doctors are not able to do so. And what happens for a doctor who's not skilled in eliciting and clarifying a patient's values? What ends up happening? According to the Emanuels, they unwittingly impose their own values under the guise of articulating the patient's values, unquote. Now that would be insidious, wouldn't it? That would mean that even though the doctor is trying to get at the patient's values, sorry I'm using so many gestures, but I find it useful, at least to me, to think of the doctor drawing something out, like a midwife draws the baby out. But if the doctor finds it difficult through lack of training or patience to bring out the patient's values, which values are going to end up coming into play? The doctor's values. That's what the Emanuels are saying here. Unwittingly, the doctor will end up imposing his or her values on the patient. And that defeats the whole purpose of this model, doesn't it? It's supposed to be the patient's values that are being brought into play here, not the doctor's values. So this model may be well-intentioned, but it ends up back to the paternalistic model, where the doctor is making a decision based on the doctor's values, or better yet, the doctor's understanding of what the patient's values are, or what most patients would want in a situation like this. Okay, so let's move on to the deliberative model. You may wonder why the Emanuels raise objections to the model that they think is the best model, the preferred model. Well, it's because they're being honest. They're canvassing objections that other people have made. In the end, the Emanuels think that the objections to the deliberative model are less severe than the objections to the other model. In other words, the Emanuels believe that the objections to the deliberative model can be responded to or replied to effectively. And therefore, they're kind of nullified. But let's at least list what those objections are before we see what the Emanuels say about them. On page 2225, the Emanuels say the following: the fundamental objections to the deliberative model focus on whether it is proper for physicians to judge patients' values and promote particular health-related values, unquote. And I'll bet that occurred to you when we were discussing the deliberative model. You probably wondered, where does the doctor get off imposing social or moral values on the patient? Maybe imposing is the wrong word, because the doctor does, after all, try to persuade the patient by giving the patient reasons why the patient should do this or that. But you may still ask, where does the doctor, by what authority does the doctor try to persuade the patient to do this or that? Right? What justifies the doctor in bringing in these alien values? And by alien, I mean these are not the patient's values, or not necessarily the patient's values. So there's a kind of arrogance here displayed by the doctor. A doctor who's following the deliberative model has a certain arrogance, in the sense that the doctor is arrogating something to him or herself that doesn't belong to that doctor. Right? It belongs to the patient. So an arrogant person is someone who arrogates. So it's kind of a greediness. I'm taking what doesn't belong to me. I'm arrogating it to myself. And that, according to the critics, is what doctors are doing in this model. Right? It's a kind of arrogance. So let's continue with the objections. According to the Emanuels, other people have said that physicians do not possess privileged knowledge of the priority of health-related values relative to other values. This model assumes that doctors have some kind of privileged access to moral values or social values. But where did the doctor get that? Why is the doctor privy to that information or to those values? Did the doctor take a course in medical school where the doctor learned the correct moral values and can then try to persuade the patient to adopt those values? So this is another problem with this model. It presupposes that the doctor has some kind of access, privileged access, which means access that others don't have, including patients. The doctor has access to the good and the just and the right and the fair. But surely doctors don't have such privileged access. If they have access at all, it's the same access that everyone has, including patients. Okay, and also the Emanuels say the following: recommendations and care provided to patients should not depend on the physician's judgment of the worthiness, that's the key word, the worthiness of the patient's values, or on the physician's particular values. When the doctor, according to this model, tries to persuade the patient to undergo a course of treatment, the doctor is saying, in effect, this is a worthy course of action for you to undertake. Remember the case of the woman with breast cancer? The doctor in that case says to her, under the deliberative model, it would be worthy of you to participate in this clinical trial, because that way you would be participating in a trial that may result in useful information that will help other women in the future, women you don't even know. You can contribute something to the well-being of women who may not yet be born, but the knowledge we acquire can help them. And the doctor may think that that's a worthy course of action, but that's a value judgment. And again, it seems arrogant for the doctor to be taking that, making that value judgment, or taking the responsibility for making that value judgment. And finally, the Emanuels mention this point, which I think is a good one. They say that patients see their physicians to receive health care, not to engage in moral deliberation or to revise their values. So just ask yourself, when you go to see a doctor because you're injured or sick, do you want your doctor to listen to you and then try to persuade you to do something based upon its production of good for society as a whole, or for women down the road in the future, or for men down the road in the future? The Emanuels are suggesting that many or most patients don't go to see a doctor for that. Right? We don't want a moral sermon or a moral lecture. We don't want our doctor to bring in alien values. We want the doctor to be focused on our well-being, our needs, our own values. Okay? Probably some patients, maybe many or most of them, want that rather than a moral philosophy seminar or a kind of an attempt to persuade. And I might add the following as my own objection to the deliberative model. How many patients have been trained in argumentation? I'm a professor of philosophy. One of the main things I teach in all of my courses is argumentation. I teach students what it means for an argument. First of all, I teach my students what an argument is, what it means to persuade somebody rationally, and I teach my students to distinguish between good arguments and bad arguments. I teach my students to identify fallacies or fallacious forms of reasoning. How many patients have had such training? How many patients, when they're presented with an argument by their doctor, will have no idea what's going on? They'll feel lost. They'll feel intimidated. My goodness, my doctor is trying to persuade me to enter a clinical trial and is giving me reasons. I don't know how to evaluate that. Right? Should I just defer to the doctor and let the doctor decide what the treatment is? Or should I fight back? But how can I fight back if I am not trained in arguing or criticizing arguments? This puts the patient in a difficult situation, I hope you can see. If the patient happened to have philosophical training, imagine that. Imagine if I were the patient, having been trained in philosophy and having taught arguing and criticizing for many years. If my doctor tried to persuade me to enroll in a clinical trial, as happened in that case of the woman with breast cancer, I might be in a position to sort through the doctor's reasoning and logic. Maybe I would even find fault with it and be able to point out to the doctor, wait a minute, doctor, now, your argument is fallacious. Let me show you why. Right? I might be able to do that. Although if I'm sick or scared or injured, my philosophical training might not be of any use to me. Right? And typically when patients go see a doctor, they're sick or injured and not at all in a position to dispassionately evaluate an argument being made by his or her doctor. Plus, you've got to remember, doctors in our society have a certain status. We revere doctors. We're in awe of them, right? We respect them. Doctors occupy a high status. If you look at public opinion polls, the institution of medicine always ranks near the top of institutions in which the public puts a lot of faith. Journalism, not so much, right? They're always near the bottom, down there with used car salespeople. So, when you go to see a doctor, you're sick or injured, you're afraid, confused, and overwhelmed. Plus, you're in the presence of someone for whom you have great respect and to whom you are inclined to show deference. Are you in any position to be the recipient of an argument from that doctor designed to persuade you to undergo a course of treatment, not for your own good exclusively, but for the good of others, as in the case of the woman with breast cancer? So this model, according to some of its critics, just requires way too much of doctors. Most doctors are going to fail if they attempt to pursue this model. And what's going to happen when they fail? They're going to revert to the paternalistic model, which the Emanuels hate. Okay? That's the old-fashioned, obsolete model of medicine. Doctor knows best. If we, in the pursuit of the ideal model, end up reverting to the least ideal model, what have we gained or accomplished? That's the real risk of shooting for the stars, right? If we go for the deliberative model, we might only increase the likelihood that we end up with the paternalistic model, when in fact there may be a couple of models that are better than the paternalistic model. Okay, I get a little bit excited here. Sorry about that. It shows you that something that's seemingly as dry as models of the physician-patient relationship, when you delve into it, you find that it's really interesting and provocative stuff. And that's why I've been teaching this essay now for several years. I teach this course every other year, and I think I've used this essay probably 4 or 5 times now. Right? When I discovered it, I said to myself, this is perfect for this course. Right? It's not that long. It's written in a way that I think my students can understand it. And it's important. It's about something we will all encounter in our lives because we all see doctors. And it gives us some options about how to think of the relationship that we have with our doctors. Okay, let's turn to the final section. It's entitled The Preferred Model and the Practical Implications. So let's talk a little bit now about the deliberative model in particular. And while we've just been talking about it, we've been looking at the downside. What's the upside? What reasons can be given in support of the deliberative model? This is where the Emanuels finally argue for it or try to persuade you that it really is the ideal or preferred model. And you may be wondering, why do we have to choose a model anyway? And what are we going to do with it? On page 2225, the Emanuels say, it is important to specify one model as the shared paradigmatic reference. So they think that it really is important that society have one understanding or model of the physician-patient relationship. My question is why? Why do we need one shared model? And in answer to that question, I might suggest the following. We need, for legal purposes, the law must embody a particular understanding of the physician-patient relationship. So ultimately, whichever model we choose will be incorporated into the law and incorporated into the regulations that are passed that are designed to regulate the physician-patient relationship. So that's why this is an important choice. The Emanuels say that they're going to adduce, A-D-D-U-C-E, it means put forward. We're going to adduce or put forward 6 points to justify this claim. So think of that as 6 independent reasons why the deliberative model is the best model of all those we've been discussing. So think of this as their argument. I'm about to give 6 premises, all of which support the same conclusion, which is that the deliberative model is to be preferred, that it's ideal. Okay, number 1. Oh, and by the way, I just noticed in my notes, on page 2226, the Emanuels say that the deliberative model is, quote, the ideal that should inform laws and policies that regulate the physician-patient interaction. So ultimately, there's a practical purpose for this abstract discussion, which goes back to what I said just a moment ago. Once we choose a model that has good grounding, right, that's grounded in good reasons, we can then use it for lawmaking purposes and regulatory purposes. So that's a practical goal. So this article is not meant to be just philosophers sitting around talking about the ideal world. This article is meant to be practical, right? It's supposed to help us choose a model that will have an effect in the real world through law and regulation. Okay, here are the 6 reasons. I'm just going to sketch them out. We're probably within 10 or 15 minutes of being done for the day. The first reason to prefer the deliberative model is that, according to the Emanuels, it more nearly embodies our ideal of autonomy. If we care about autonomy, and they think that of course we do, we should choose whichever model more nearly incorporates our ideal of autonomy. And this one does that, they say. Here's why. Page 2226, I believe. I didn't put the page reference this time, but I believe it's that same page. Listen carefully now. Autonomy requires that individuals critically assess their own values and preferences, determine whether they are desirable, affirm upon reflection these values as ones that should justify their actions, and then be free to initiate action to realize the values. That's the ideal of autonomy. Notice there's a lot packed in there, right? We need to be able to critically assess our own values. Each of us has values. Some of us have reflected critically on our own values. Others have not. An autonomous person does critically evaluate or assess his or her own values. For example, suppose I value an active life at the expense of a more contemplative or thoughtful life. Maybe I give too much emphasis to that, right? Maybe I'm giving too much weight to the active life and too little to the contemplative life, right? That's a possibility, in which case I may decide to cut back my activities and reallocate my time to reading or study. Right? This is a decision people have to make. If you value both activity and contemplation, you may critically evaluate that and decide to reallocate your time and your energy. So you're examining your values to see whether they're correctly ordered and prioritized. Okay, the next thing an autonomous person does is you want to determine whether your values are desirable. Right? What if you value spending time with your friends and it comes at the expense of time with your children? Right? You may decide that that's not, the desire to spend time with your friends is not worth having. Right? Some time with your friends may be appropriate, but not so much that you're not spending adequate time with your children. Autonomy requires that you be able to affirm upon reflection that your values are ones that should justify your actions. So this connects your values with your actions. And autonomy requires that you have the freedom to act upon whichever set of values you find appropriate. So autonomy is a very rich notion. And according to the Emanuels, this model, the deliberative model, has the correct understanding of autonomy. And the doctor's role is very important. The doctor will discuss with you, the doctor will elicit your values, but also criticize your values. This is the only model where the doctor criticizes your values in the way a friend would. You would expect your friend to intervene and tell you, honestly, you're spending too much time with your activities or hobbies and not enough time with your children. So your friend doesn't just accept your values, your friend is willing and able to criticize your values in an attempt to get you to change your life or your activity. And the doctor plays the role of a friend in this model. That's one of the terms the Emanuels use to describe the doctor's role, friend. Okay, second reason out of 6, and I'll go a little bit quicker from now on. This model, unlike the other models, accords with personal expectations. Now, here's what they say. I'm not so sure I agree with this for what that's worth, but here's what they say. They say, we expect the best physicians to engage their patients in evaluative discussions of health issues and related values. We expect that. Now, I have several questions about that, actually. First of all, who is this we? This is the editorial we. Okay, it may include the Emanuels, but who else are they speaking for besides themselves? I might say in response to that, speak for yourself, Emanuels. Right? You might expect the best physicians to engage their patients in evaluative discussions, but I don't. Maybe most people don't, or many people don't. So they're speaking in the imperial way, right? They're speaking as though they're speaking for everybody, and maybe they're not. The second problem I have with this is it's question begging. We're trying to choose a model of the physician-patient relationship, and they're giving reasons why we should choose it. And one of their reasons is, this is what we expect our physicians to do. Well, wait a minute. We're trying to decide what we want our physicians to do. The fact that we expect them to do it is arguing in a circle. We expect our physicians to engage us in moral deliberation. Therefore, the fact that we expect that means that this is the correct model. Right? It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, if you will. So there's something question-begging about this, right? If you're trying to choose a model, you can't assume that the model is correct because we're trying to choose a model. Okay, the third reason in favor of this model, they say it's not a disguised form of paternalism, right? It's not. It doesn't say that doctor knows best, because the patient's values do, after all, come into play. So I think they're right about that. The deliberative model, as they have set it up and described it, is not identical to the paternalistic model. But remember what I said a few minutes ago. If the doctor is so overwhelmed with this deliberative task, the doctor might revert to the paternalistic model and end up imposing his or her values or social values on the patient, not through persuasion or deliberation, but by imposition. So this model, while it's not itself the paternalistic model, it may lead straight to it. And that's just about as bad, if not as bad. Fourth of 6 reasons, the Emanuels say on page 2226, physician values are relevant to patients and do inform their choice of a physician, unquote. So what are they saying there? They seem to be saying that for most patients, we care what our doctor's values are, and that's indeed why many of us choose a certain doctor. I may choose a doctor not knowing what the doctor's values are, but once I meet with the doctor a few times, I may decide I don't like the doctor's values or the doctor's approach. I'm gonna fire the doctor and go elsewhere. People do shop around, as you know, for doctors. They keep going from doctor to doctor until they find one with whom they're comfortable, whose values they agree with, whose method seems amenable to the patient or seems correct to the patient. So the Emanuels think that we already, to some extent, do choose doctors on the basis of their values. And that ties in with this notion that the doctor in this model is making decisions based upon our values and the doctor's understanding of moral or social values. Number 5, the Emanuels point out that this model, the deliberative model, accords with social expectations. They point out that we do think, most of us, many of us, some of us, do believe that doctors should, quote, promote health-related values. And they give some examples. And you could ask yourself, do you expect your doctor to bring the following values into play when you go see a doctor? Values such as safe sex. Do you expect your doctor to bring into the discussion the various methods of safe sex to prevent transmission of sexually transmitted diseases, or like such as HIV, or which is pretty serious, or pregnancy, if you want to consider that under the heading of safe sex. Do we not expect our doctors to help us with abstention from alcohol? If a patient has an alcohol or a drinking problem, I think many patients would expect the doctor to step in and advise against excessive drinking. What about obesity? If you are obese and you go see a doctor, do you expect your doctor to talk to you about the perils of obesity and the social costs of obesity? Remember our discussion of Sarah Conley's essay? Sarah Conley points out that obesity imposes great costs on us as a society. So would you expect a doctor to say to you, suppose you're obese, you go to your doctor can either bring social values into play or not. The Emanuel seem to be saying that most of us expect the doctor to bring those values into play and to say to you, your obesity is not only affecting you and your health and in various ways, making you more susceptible to other diseases, but your obesity is imposing costs on others in society. So for their sake, you should take steps to lose weight, and I can help you with that. So the Emanuel seem to be saying that we already expect doctors to bring social values into play, the values of safe sex, the values of not drinking to excess. People who are excessive drinkers may pose a threat to others through drunk driving, for example, or family fighting, domestic violence. So if we already expect doctors to bring some social values into the discussion, that seems to support this model, which requires that doctors do that sort of thing. And finally, the Emanuels point out that this model counteracts something that's bad, which is, and we discussed it earlier, which is the tendency towards specialization in medicine. They say if the deliberative model seems most appropriate, then we need to implement changes in medical care and education to encourage a more caring approach. We need to, if this really is the ideal model, then we need to take steps to implement it in society, and that can be costly, and we need to be prepared to pay those costs. So they say we must develop a healthcare financing system that properly reimburses rather than penalizes physicians for taking the time to discuss values with their patients. So, assuming doctors have the capacity, the ability to discuss values, we need to make it so that they don't pay a personal price for doing so, right? We need to make sure that doctors get reimbursed for the time they spend talking about values with their patients. I have a diagram here that I found on the internet. It's from a reliable source. Maybe you can see it. It says how many minutes doctors say they spend with each patient. And it's broken down by the sex of the doctor. And I'm going to ignore that for the present purposes because you can see that the two lines in each case are pretty close together. So let's just leave the difference between male and female doctors out of the picture. What it shows is this, that 6% of doctors spend less than 9 minutes per patient. Okay, that's a pretty small percentage. 21% of doctors spend between 10 and 12 minutes per patient. 29% of doctors spend between 13 and 16 minutes with each patient. And then 21% spend 17 to 20 minutes. So you can see on this diagram, the whoops, right here. See this, the one that goes the highest, right there? Whoops, kind of hard, right there. That suggests that the typical interaction between a doctor and a patient, the typical interaction lasts between 13 and 16 minutes. Some are shorter, some are longer. But the typical interaction is between 13 and 16 minutes. Now, I ask you, how much can a doctor do in 13 to 16 minutes? That's barely enough time to get the patient to describe his or her symptoms. It's barely enough time for the doctor to look at what the patient has filled out in the waiting room or what the physician's assistant has written down before the doctor came into the room. So once the doctor looks at the chart, asks the patient a few questions, the patient gets to tell the doctor what's going on. How much time is left in that 13 to 16 minute period to go into the patient's values? It's absurd. The very idea that this deliberative model could work in the current way medicine is set up is preposterous. So what the Emanuels are saying is, if we really take this model seriously and plan to implement it, we've got to change the practice of medicine. We need to increase the amount of time doctors spend with each patient so that the doctor has time to elicit the patient's values and make a case for why the patient should do this rather than something else. It simply takes time to do that. Doctors aren't going to take the time to do that if they're not compensated for it. That's a fact of life. So we have to find a way to reimburse doctors financially for the time that we expect them to spend talking about values with their patients. Okay, and in closing, now that they believe they've made a case for the deliberative model, in spite of its weaknesses, which we saw earlier, the Emanuels point out that this deliberative model might be used elsewhere in society, in other contexts. They say that maybe the lawyer-client relationship could use more of this deliberation and persuasion. They think that the relationship between religious mentor and laity, or the lay people of the religion, could benefit from this deliberative model, and also educator-student relationships, teacher-student. So teachers should not just dispense information to their students, but teachers should engage their students, find out what their students' values are, and make the material relevant to their students' lives. It should be a richer interaction other than, and maybe you've had courses like this where the teacher does all the talking. Now, given this situation we're in right now with COVID and my having to do lectures on video, it's unfortunate that it's a one-way flow of information, right? It's temporary. When I'm in a classroom, and some of you who may have had me in the classroom, you know that I'm always open to questions. We have a dialogue back and forth between me and a particular student or other students who get involved. It's a richer interaction than what we have right now, but we're doing the best we can with this technology. But I assume that at some point it's going to stop and we're going to go back in the classroom. Maybe this fall. I haven't heard anything yet, but we'll see what they decide. Anyway, it's nice that we can do it, isn't it? Given that we can't have the ideal setting of the classroom, it's nice that we can meet like this and that you can learn and we can discuss things. Okay, that's enough for today. We're done now with the Emanuels. You'll be tested on that essay as well as the previous two. And remember, the exam is Monday, the 22nd of February. So what you should do is at 8 o'clock Monday, or any time in the 12 hours after that, between 8 and 8 on Monday, make sure your studying is done. Go in there, Once you get started, you have 75 minutes to complete the exam. And then check your score. I assume you'll see your score once you answer the last question. Okay, and I'll put up my next lecture. My first lecture next week will be either Tuesday or Wednesday. Probably Wednesday, because I like to do my ethics lecture on Tuesday. But you'll get 2 lectures next week. And in the meantime, in between studying, if you need a break, download and print the New Mexico Supreme Court case, Morris versus Brandenburg. I've posted it on Canvas. Print it and read, let's say, at least a third of it, maybe a half of it for the first lecture next week, probably on Wednesday. All right, that's enough for today. Have a great day and good luck in your studying.